So, good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us from the West Coast. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name, as you may already know, is Victoria Thacker, and I will be your host for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, webinars, or events, I invite you to visit our website at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Before we begin the presentation, please note that everyone has been muted, but if you have any questions or anything during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function or raise your hand and note them in the chat. We will be addressing all questions at the end of the session just to ensure we can keep running through it smoothly and everything, but I will flag them for the speaker at the end of the session. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Linda Wood Edwards. Linda is a seasoned governance consultant and the owner of LUE-42 Enterprises. With over 2 decades of experience, she works with boards across Canada and serves as a corporate secretary to several organizations. A certified association executive, accredited director, and fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, she is also our chief examiner for the International Qualifying Program's Corporate Governance module, as well as a facilitator for the Director's Education Accreditation program. So with all of that, please join me in welcoming Linda Wood Edwards.
Thank you, Victoria, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining and for inviting me to share on this topic. Excuse me. For the most part, this is not a side-by-side comparison of corporations and nonprofit corporations. It's more of a conversation based on my 2 to 3 decades working predominantly in the third sector. I have a great respect and love for nonprofits, and it's probably going to show as we go through this. And you can see from this agenda, it sort of starts from the point of view of nonprofits. We're going to cover quite a lot of ground, so thanks for being along for the ride. So, what does it mean? The term nonprofit has been used for a long time, but it can confuse people. It does speak to the nature and structure of the organization, but a lot of directors in nonprofits thought it meant they weren't allowed to make a profit. And so then somebody introduced the term not-for-profit, which clarifies a little bit more about, okay, our intention is not for profit, it's something else. But then still directors were coming on and thinking that they were wrong to make a profit. I use nonprofit and not-for-profit interchangeably. Some people think nonprofit now refers to charitable. I've never found that that one doesn't really wash necessarily with me. Now you'll hear social profit, which still doesn't necessarily mean it's charitable, and it also doesn't cover most of the nonprofits I work with. So nonprofit, not-for-profit, social profit, you're going to hear it all, and don't let it confuse you. What we need to know is the purpose of the enterprise is not to make a profit, it's to make some other sort of difference. But this, speaking to directors out there, does not mean it should not be profitable. And it definitely doesn't mean it's not allowed to be profitable. And we'll dig into that a little more. So what are some of the differences? So nonprofit corporations are free to conduct the same business activities as business corporations, including making a profit. And if they do make a profit, they might be subject to income tax, but mostly they are exempt from paying taxes under the Income Tax Act. The main difference between nonprofit corporations and business corporations really has to do with how we're structured. On the one hand, business corporations issue shares, which represent ownership, and the owners of the corporations are the shareholders. Whereas nonprofit corporations have members instead of shareholders. They're still considered kind of the owners, but we call them something else. and we cannot issue dividends. If there's a profit at the end of the year, and we really hope there is, it needs to be reinvested in the organization to carry out your mission. And importantly, directors of nonprofit corporations are held to the same standards as directors in business corporations. Now, this did not used to be true. Nonprofit directors used to have a lesser standard. It was almost like you're just playing at it, playing house or something. Not so anymore. And that's a really important distinction. You'll see more and more nonprofits now with directors and officers liability insurance, things we'll talk about in a minute. So it's important that you know that there are eyes on you. So there are lots of types of nonprofits, and we can classify them either as business, community, or government nonprofits. A business nonprofit would be something like chambers of commerce, protection services, condominium associations, strata corporations, and that. Community nonprofit institutions would be like around community food services, community housing, emergency relief, religious organizations, advocacy groups, sports and recreation, those sorts of things that make our lives better. And then the government nonprofit institutions, we're thinking hospitals, universities, colleges. They're self-governing and they exist independent of government, but they're heavily influenced by them. Within these three types of nonprofits, you'll also find charitable organizations. Charitable organizations is not a separate category. In any of these, there can be charitable status, which is a classification under the Income Tax Act that allows you to give basically tax receipts. So not all nonprofits are charitable, and charities can appear in any of those. If you're thinking about joining the board of a nonprofit organization, you might want to consider which ones of these it is, and you might also want to think about the scope of it. Is it local? Is it provincial or regional? Is it national? Is it international? There's lots of permutations and combinations. So why do we care about nonprofits? Well, there are over 170,000 of them registered nationally in Canada, 85,000 of which are registered charities. Keep in mind also that each province and territory has its own Societies Act, another way that nonprofits can be registered, sort of provincially or regionally. So this is just a federal lens. And these stats come from Statistics Canada as well as Imagine Canada that does a lot of research on the sector. In 2020, the impact in Canada of this sector was 185 billion or 9% of GDP. That's bigger than a lot of those big industries that you're thinking about. Extraction industries, retail, like it's huge. So broken down into those three types, you see what adds up to that 185 billion. Obviously, the community ones, they're kind of in the middle of the road. Government ones, not surprisingly, are the bigger ones, and the business ones are smaller. Interestingly, the money adds up to the 185 billion, but the percentages don't add up. So I'm not going to worry about that. The sector is a big employer. I think 1 in 15 Canadians works in the nonprofit sector. 2.4 million people, in fact, and nearly half of all of the jobs in the nonprofit sector are held by immigrants. That's a stat I just found this morning, which I had no idea about. And of those, they're predominantly in the community nonprofit institutions. In addition, though, to the employment, we've got over 13 million volunteers giving close to 2 billion hours a year. This is stuff that isn't hitting the financial statements of the company. So think about that. That's $41.8 billion. That's a bit of an old stat, but this is increasing. So this piece of the volunteerism piece of nonprofit is a huge driver of the sector and in keeping us in livable communities. So not to be dismissed. And good evidence as to why directors of nonprofit corporations are held to the same standards as the other one. So in a typical nonprofit system, it's a continuous loop. We could look at this vertically as well, because it's not a hierarchy. But in the nonprofit world, members elect a board who hire an executive director or CEO who reports to the board, who then in turn report to the members at the AGM. For charities, substitute members for donors. For communities, it's whatever citizens. For a publicly funded hospital, the one who cares might be the Minister of Health. So the ownership, who's in that left box, really depends on the nature of the organization. But I think if you just think about it for a second, you'll see that the model works in really any board structure, including corporations. And so it's simple, but it's really kind of perfect. And every type of those organizations has a board. So whether you're a corporate public listed company, a privately owned company, a financial services company, an insurance company, a credit union, a crown corporation, and so on, you kind of fit into this model. What's interesting about the nonprofit side is sometimes they don't have the money to hire staff or a lot of staff, and you'll find the same people filling each box. So over here, we're the members, and then we vote ourselves in at the AGM and act like a board, and we set the strategic direction for it. And then in the third box, we roll our sleeves up and do all the work ourselves. And then we report to ourselves at regular intervals, and then we will report to the greater mass of ourselves at an annual general meeting. So even with thousands of staff or no staff, the model still works. One of the things that's different in the corporations is on the board side. You'll find the management staff also potentially having board positions. That doesn't happen in the nonprofit sector. And we'll talk a little bit about why that part of the model is a bit risky. And so because I love boards so much, I always want to talk about governance. So governance coming from the Latin gubernare, which means to steer. So it refers to the directing, the steering of a corporation, of a corporate entity. And what we generally hear about what is governance, it's about providing authoritative direction and control over an enterprise. A lot of this, from a governance perspective, came out of the Cadbury report in the UK when things were starting to go wrong with corporations and people started to look at boards deeply for the first time. In the nonprofit side, they talk less about authority, direction, and control, even though those are true. They talk about the board being about making policy, and management and administration being carrying it out. So board being on one side, management being on the other. My longtime colleague from the Banff Executive Leadership Center, Doug McNamara, he has a very clunky, convoluted definition of governance, but it's the one I love and it's the one I use all the time. So when I say the word governance, I'm talking about a combination of policy systems and structures within an operational framework that the governing body, that's the board, puts into place to ensure the leadership of the organization, that's the CEO or ED, makes appropriate decisions and takes the right actions to deliver whatever it is you're supposed to be delivering in an effective and accountable manner. So it's not, governance is not running a meeting using Robert's Rules of Order. It's not just direction, it's not just control, but it's systems, structures, accountabilities, frameworks. And that's why I, love governance so much. It's kind of a new toy every day. There's always an element of it that we can look at. In the nonprofit sector, the emergent guru, I'd say, of the last decade or so is a guy named Richard Chait. Um, and he adds an important dimension to that direction and control thing. And that's about making sense of it all and being aligned with values. And I will jump back into that a bit more. So whether you're corporate, whether you're nonprofit, the board's job is about direction, control, and making sense of things. So they talk about kinds of boards. We talk about kinds of boards and board models. On one end, I think of it as a continuum, not a right and wrong, a this or a that. But at one end of the continuum, we have those community builders, those founders, those people who say, our community is lacking this. Let's find like-minded people, get together, start something up. We'll start an enterprise. We'll start with a small board. We're going to get together and do this. And that's kind of like I talked in the continuous loop. There are also the ones who need to have the big vision that's required of a board, but they're also the doers. They're the volunteers. They have to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. Then we have sort of the governance board, the policy governance board. All boards are the ultimate corporate accountability and authority. But on this end of the continuum, the board directs the enterprise by approving a strategic plan, delegating to the CEO what can be delegated, who in turn delegates things to staff to carry out towards the mission of the enterprise. So all boards have a governing or governance role. And in the nonprofit sector, many of them also kind of have an operational role just in terms of getting all of the work done. We're not talking here about advisory boards, which give counsel, but they do not govern. Typically, an advisory board would be attached to an operational element in the organization, and its authority is granted by the organization. Whereas these kinds of boards, the authority is granted from the owners, the members, the shareholders. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Any board, no matter what kind, has tools available to it. And in every board's toolbox, I like to see these things. So legislation and regulations. Every enterprise in Canada has some higher authority. On the corporate side, depending on the nature of your business, you may have a lot of regulations around it. On the nonprofit side, generally we have fewer, but there are still some. For instance, if you're in a health profession, your association is a nonprofit, but there's a requirement that you protect the public and not just operate in your own self-interest. So there are regulations attached even in the nonprofit sector, but perhaps not as many or as stringently as you might find on some of the corporate side. You're going to have your constating documents, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws. Don't just incorporate and lose those. These are living, breathing things that can be a great tool to a board. I think where a board can be most effective and nimble is in creating policies, terms of reference, charters of expectations, and things like that. You don't need to go beyond the board to get approval for things like that. Government doesn't weigh in on it. Even the members and shareholders don't. It's just how we're going to do our business. So there's a big opportunity in that policy area. And basically that's codifying the decisions that your board makes. You may find nonprofits maybe don't have very robust policies, and maybe not a great requirement for them under legislation or regulations. But really, any motion at a board meeting is codifying a decision of the board, and so it's a de facto policy. Another really essential tool is a strategic plan, typically looking 3 years out. Then we have the operational plan that the CEO creates based on the strategic plan. It's basically 1 year of it, and the budget then funds that 1 year operational plan. Those two things are the CEO's marching orders, so it's really important that the board makes sure that these are in place. How a board structures itself, whether corporate or nonprofit, tells us something about how effective it's going to be, how nimble it can be, and responsive, and how effective ultimately. And then, as with every thing we get involved with in our lives, it comes down to relationships and how a board deals with its senior most staff person. So I like to remind boards that it's not just a 1 hour orientation when you get on. It's not just a set of bylaws, but a maneuvering of all the presence of and the maneuvering of all of these things can help you be way more effective, whether it's for your community nonprofit or your corporation. So if we go to the legislation, we want the board, any board, to be able to act as a team. We want each director to be an experience, and we want to find a suitable balance of power between individual directors compared to the group, because actually individual directors have no power. It's only the collective. And I know some of you are sitting there going, well, wait a minute, that's not how my board works, but it's true. Individuals don't have the power, just the collective does. So you want to make sure the board has what it needs to be effective, acting in the interests of the corporation and the key stakeholders. So in terms of setting up one or the other, both of them, you need at least one director. And on the corporate side, if it's a public issuer, you need at least 3. On the nonprofit side, if it's a soliciting corporation, which means you're going to get more than $10,000 from the public, which most of them will, you need at least 3 directors, 2 of whom are not officers, employees of the corporation. That is significantly different from the corporate side, because on the corporate side, you do have officers and who are employees sitting on the board. It just doesn't happen on the nonprofit side. In both cases, you have to be at least 18, competent, not an undischarged bankrupt, and be an individual. So a company can't be a director on a board. And on the corporate side, at least 25% of your directors have to be Canadian residents. On the nonprofit side, there is no residency requirement. But because so many of them are dependent on some hands-on effort, it doesn't come up all that much in my experience. Eligibility could vary by province, so that's something to look out for. And when you decide the size of a board, I mean, there's been a lot of research done on the optimal size of a board, and it really depends so much on the nature of the organization and what's available to you. But you want to consider when you're coming up with that number or range, the balance, what your bylaws say, how many board committees you're going to have, what they are and what the skills are, what the need for independence is. Too many people, and it's difficult for the board to have productive meetings and constructive discussions, and it's very hard to make prompt and good decisions. So I think the latest research is, I think, somewhere in the 11 to 13 range. You'll often see nonprofit boards that are bigger, but we are seeing a decrease, thankfully. And on the corporate side, we can see smaller, but I do think I'm seeing more in the 9 to 11 range than the 11 to 13 or 15. So there's a definite trend to smaller size boards that can be more nimble. The Canadian Coalition of Good Governance says that the most important governance requirement is to have directors of quality. And by quality, they mean people with integrity, expert knowledge, relevant experience in business or the industry, and with time, and this is important, time and motivation to understand and carry on the fiduciary duties in the long-term best interests of the corporation and its stakeholders. So that's what we mean by directors of quality. So where and how do we find them? Well, both nonprofits and corporations use nominations or nominating committees now. Nonprofits, they had a model for really decades across Canada that they get to a couple of past presidents or past chairs together to be the nominations committee. That's falling by the boards as not a great practice anymore. On the corporate side, National Policy 58201, you're going to see there should be 3 on a corporate nominations committee, all independent. So that means not officers and employees of the company. And I think that's a pretty good recommendation. Recall on the nonprofit side, they already are independent. So the independence factor isn't a big thing. But so in terms of best practice for either type of company, the search for new directors should be carried out by a committee that the board appoints and delegates the responsibility to do the task. The effort should be rigorous to ensure you come up with a short list of candidates that can contribute the skills, knowledge, and expertise that the board has. Now, I always use the strategic plan as the measure, and I create like a skills matrix. And based on where we are in the evolution of the strategic plan, if we have 4 vacancies coming up on the board, and we know that the remaining directors are good at these things, what are we missing? And that's what we recruit for. So again, there should be some rigor around it, some paperwork. And as we go through it, you know, in conversations about diversity, we should make sure that whatever process we're using isn't going to disadvantage people who haven't traditionally been on this board. And how do we find people who wouldn't normally have been on this board? And so there's lots of information and research and excellent rationale to make our boards look and actually be more interesting and in turn be more effective. So doing what we always did to get people on our board may not be the best move going forward. I think we need to open it up more. So having done that, the nomination committee makes a recommendation to the board. And the board then, you know, I shouldn't have needed to put this bullet in, but I do. The board needs to consider those recommendations and in normal circumstances be expected to accept that recommendation. This is not an invitation for the board to undo all the work done by the nominations committee and try to bring their friends in. So, you know, assume, you know, give the nomination committee good guidelines, let them do their job, delegate that responsibility, and in turn, you should probably respect the decisions or the recommendations coming out of them. The nominating committee itself doesn't have authority to make these appointments, it goes to the board, which then in turn, the board having seen and small a approved, then goes to the members or the shareholders for approval, typically at an annual general meeting. When we look at that skills matrix, we should also be looking at some of those soft skills, like can people get along with each other? Are they able to listen to each other? Are other points of view involved in this? Some people present really well on paper in a box checking exercise, but it's not until you get them in the room that you realize this might not be the fit. And I do air quotes fit, but it actually is really important. In the nonprofit sector, when people are volunteering their time, not being paid to be at the table, and yet to bring all of their skills, experience, passion, and time, you don't want them to sit around with a bunch of jerks, no matter how skilled they are. So personality matters. And on the corporate side, you don't really want that either, but everybody's getting paid something, so somehow it doesn't sting quite as badly. Still, nobody wants to spend their time like that. This is not a session on diversity, but if on the corporate side, if you're publicly traded, you need to provide certain information to shareholders on diversity, what your policies and practice for board and for senior management, number and percentage, the list of women, Aboriginal people, members of visible minorities, persons with disabilities, what they call designated groups. There is no quota imposed here under any bit of legislation, but much more the Canadian way is if you're not doing it, you know, you're either going to comply, or if you're not, you should tell us why you're not doing it. And this is very much mirroring the securities law. Often it extends to the C-suite. Again, looking for the same kind of reporting in. Nonprofits, interestingly, have kind of been there all along. Diversity on nonprofit boards is not something that we've had to really target. It's just happened. I mentioned the 50-30 challenge here because it's the closest thing to a comply or explain thing that I've seen, and it's typically in arts organizations across Canada. They aspire to two goals in this: gender parity, so 50% women and or non-binary people on Canadian boards and senior management, and significant representation being 30% on Canadian boards or managements of other equity deserving groups. And they say those who identify as racialized, Black, or people of color, visible minorities, people with disabilities, including invisible and episodic disabilities, 2S LGBTQ+ and or gender and sexually diverse individuals, and Aboriginal and or Indigenous peoples, including recognition of all of our First Peoples. And so arts organizations have been, many have been on this 50-30 challenge. And it has been interesting, and I say interesting in the same way my former mother-in-law used to describe my cooking, you know, just interesting, not necessarily good. So I am watching that with interest, but it is the most kind of dramatic piece on diversity that I've seen in the nonprofit sector, and it's certainly not universally adopted. And it has been quite dramatic to watch them try to comply with this. And I honestly can't remember what year that they're meant to comply by, but it's coming right up. So that speaks to nominations, where we might get people, how we might get people, and the kinds of people we might want to look for. Now, I'm going to pop back to governance because a nerd like me can't really go more than 10 minutes without talking about board responsibilities. So we're back to Richard Chait, and although he in his more recent publications is talking about nonprofit boards, these are characteristics of any high performing board, whether nonprofit or corporate. And so what we've got is the strategic, the fiduciary, or the legal, so direction and control, and that generative piece I mentioned. So when we look at the strategic direction, this is where a board asks, what are we going to do? That's where you set the direction for the entity, the nonprofit or the company. You scan the horizon, you look at your comparative advantage, and you create a strategic plan. That's board work. It's essential board work. Then we look at the sort of control area, the legal piece. How are we going to do it? The fiduciary is, Chait doesn't use the word as I would use it, but for the sake of argument, it's there. That's where we're looking at our assets, our operations, the legal ramifications, results, resources, stewardship over the enterprise. Again, you see nonprofit and corporate both have these needs. And then when we get to the generative, it's why are we going to do it? So we're going to confront the challenges based on our traditions and values. What matters to us? What does this mean to us if we do it? So it's about framing issues and making sense of things. So again, away from direction and control and towards a three-pronged approach. A high-performing board is going to look at all of these things and not just look at them, but in fact do them. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And why did we want to do that? So, yeah. My gosh, I love talking about this, but I'm going to we'll just move on and take each piece one step further. So you hear the word, and I know everybody on this call is intimately familiar with fiduciary duty. If you ask people in the community what fiduciary duty is, though, you might get an answer like, it means I know how to read financial statements, which is just really such a tiny piece of it. So legally, fiduciary duty is four-pronged. We act honestly and in good faith. We're loyal to and act in the best interests of the corporation. We avoid any conflict of interest, and we subordinate every personal interest to those of the corporation. So that's a loyalty piece. And then there's also the duty of care, which is to behave as a reasonably prudent person would behave in similar circumstances. We're not talking about expert level, we're talking about reasonableness and prudence. What's interesting here is these are not optional. These are in the Canada Business Corporations Act, and these are in the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. You will also probably see them in your constating documents. They may have been repeated in your article of incorporation or into your bylaws or both. And then you may have board policies that repeat them again. Even if you didn't say anything in your documents, because you are governed under one piece of that legislation or the other, these exist. Where I see it doesn't land, people don't understand it, is often in a condominium corporation where you tend to get a few good people trying to do the best for their living community, where somebody wants to get on the board because they've got an axe to grind. And they don't understand about the best interests of the enterprise. I had a friend who ran for a school board job because a school board trustee role, because she didn't want her kids' school to close. But So you can run on that platform, you can get elected, but once you're actually sitting at the table, then you realize, or somebody like me has to tell you, no, you're looking at the whole system, the whole scheme. And perhaps the closure of that school is in the best interests of the corporation. So it involves a real widening out of the view that a person needs to take. And so, yeah, if a person on a board learns nothing else, this is the one thing I want them to know, whether they're corporate or nonprofit. Every now and then you get a surprised look. But I often find that even the surprised people will say, well, that's even better than I imagined. I'm glad to be involved. I can do this. This is something I'm passionate about. So one more deep dive on this one has to do around the confidentiality and conflict of interest thing. For any board in any sector, assume confidentiality. Assume everything that comes to you is confidential. You don't talk about it outside of that room until somebody gives you speaking notes and tells you to go talk about it. In terms of identifying conflict of interest, use, if I have something to gain or somebody in my family has something to gain, a direct personal interest, a pecuniary interest, then it's probably conflict of interest. So what you need to do is call it out. And you need rules or a policy around conflict of interest. I don't care which sector you're in. You got to declare it. You got to get out of the way, leave the room. The board will determine, yes, you're in a conflict, or no, if you're not. And we record in the minutes, those corporate secretaries out there, we say what was declared, when the person went out, what was decided, when the person comes back in, because minutes are compellable in a court of law. And man, this is an area where you need I's dotted and T's crossed. Another thing about conflict of interest is perception is reality. And you may not be, but the perception is there. So it's best to also get that documented, that you've at least discussed the perception. With some of the boards I work with in both sectors, we have a regular agenda item right at the top. The person received all of the information package for the board meeting. One of the first items on the agenda is, having seen the materials, does anyone have a conflict of interest to declare? And so we set the tone at the top of the meeting that this matters and that we're watching for it. Um, uh, and we want to support good process in it. Not saying you're evil or anything. We just need to apply our process and get it done. And so that usually goes pretty well, and it's a good tone setter. But then as you go through the meeting, something else may emerge on any of those topics where that starts to shift. And you may not have been in conflict at the start, but you might be partway through. In that case, you've got to call it out. You stop things where they are. It's really the only item of board business that you should be allowed to revisit as many times as you need to. Normally, we complete board business and move on. But on a conflict of interest, it needs to be out there whenever you see it. So make sure your policy doesn't have to be more significant than that large bubble there. Document that and you've got a policy, you're good to go. So moving on to that second part of the triangle, the strategic responsibilities, where are we headed? So the board's going to set the direction and agree on the strategy. When they're talking about this, what do we need to consider? That's where, and you've all been through these, we do the SWOT analysis, the environmental factors, all those other sorts of things that we might do to help inform where we're going to go. And then once we've got that, we allocate who does what and how do we resource it. And usually about at that point, that's when the board turns it over to the CEO. I really implore boards to create your board agendas tied directly to the strategic plan. If you're talking about something at your board meeting that isn't going to lead you to accomplish one of your strategic imperatives, then why are you talking about it? And then on the nonprofit side, I also encourage the boards um, in this strategic area to really consider capacity. There are a lot of good ideas out there, a lot of good people to do something, something helpful with a good idea. But do we really have the human, financial, and technological resources to do the thing? And if you're honest about it, sometimes the answer is no. In the nonprofit world, we typically see the entire board being involved in the creation of the strategic plan, the CEO kind of fleshing it out, and then the board approving it, and then turning it back over to the CEO to carry out as the marching orders. And the corporate side, we often see the CEO and management team creating the plan and presenting it to the board. And then that is what, the board then informs it, considers it, and approves it. Both ways are good, and both are effective. Uh, it is hard to get lots of people together. And if you have a management team of one, you're a very lean staffed nonprofit, you're going to rely on the whole board. So neither of these are right or wrong. I think who does the bulk of the work on it will depend on the organization. But ultimately, the board approves it, and then the CEO uses it as marching orders. On the generative, I won't spend much time here, but the green line that goes down is the typical board involvement curve. And by typical board involvement, we are talking about those direction and control pieces. People on boards like to check boxes. What Chait is saying that is above that, the generative curve, that's the opportunity for real generative, meaningful work. So we have a lot of smart people around our board tables checking boxes and making sure they don't get caught up in conflict of interest. But what if we tapped in to the rest of their big, beautiful brains? We've got this much more room. And that's what I find really exciting about this third element of being a great board. And it doesn't have to lead to a solution. It just leads to opening up the conversation and not seeing things the way we've always seen them or doing them the way we've always done them, and literally just making sense of things. So it's a dialogue opportunity intended to promote shared understanding and emphasize your core values. So into our comparisons again. This is a slide that could easily have been 8 slides, and I'm just cramming it in. Directors on both sides have liability issues, and they're the same: criminal, civil, statutory, employee and workplace, income tax, environmental, and business practices being the main areas of liability that a director will face. I've highlighted the employee, workplace, and income tax because those are the places nonprofit boards get into more trouble than anywhere else. Sure, occasionally there's criminal, there's a fraudulent, finance director or treasurer, but usually it's around a lack of expertise to dealing with the people. It's constructive dismissal. It's I didn't give record of employment. It's something unpleasant in the workplace. It comes down to the people stuff. So again, liabilities are the same for both corporations and nonprofits. Nonprofits are more likely to trip on the people ones. On the protection of directors, again, these work in both realms. Indemnification, there's some wording in your legislation, there's some word in your constating documents, including the articles and maybe the bylaws, that says if a board is acting in good faith and doing its fiduciary duty, you and your heirs will be saved harmless. And so, but if you're not, if you're acting with nefarious purposes, they're going to let you twist in the wind. So there is this indemnification layer built into both pieces of legislation and some of those follow-on documents. You're going to see directors and officers liability insurance. You're going to get independent advice. Any board, what skills and expertise you have around the table and in your management team. But if you don't have the right ones for the current problem you're working on, then you should get independent advice. The conflict of interest policy, competing interests, you need that documented, as we've addressed. You should have good policies. You should ratify your decisions. At an AGM, it's an opportunity for the members or the shareholders to hear the report of what happened last year or over the last 12 months. It's kind of maybe not a formal ratification vote, but it's kind of the blessing. Okay, we got you, now we move on to the next year. Individual directors doing their due diligence is a huge way to protect yourself and the entire board. Getting good board training, whether it's how to read a financial statement, whether it's fiduciary responsibility, whatever it is you're dealing with, there should be some board development, and then creating good policies. So all of those things can help protect a board from liability. I always tell boards we can't stop people from suing us, but we can do quite a bit to keep them from successfully suing us. And all of those things kind of fall into that. Risk management, well, it's got its own course and many of them, but risk comes up as a normal result of doing business, but the degree varies. And so, as well as I do, how they need to be identified, evaluated, strategies put in place to deal with them. And a board will have to declare its risk appetite. And this is very much a working relationship with the CEO and management team. I put this little quadrant up here because a lot of nonprofits didn't talk about risk management until, 10, 15 years ago. And then what I saw when they started to think about their operations through a risk lens, they got paralyzed into inactivity. And so I used this quadrant and I offer it in case it helps any of you. But of all those risks that you've identified, whether in your strategic planning session or whether your CEO brought them forward, let the board focus on, this would be horrible if it happened, and there's a really good chance that it's going to happen. So that upper quadrant, the high impact, high likelihood, if you let the board loose in all those other ones, you might not get anything done. Certainly in the nonprofit world, they will freeze right up. So we need trust in the CEO and the management team that these are all being looked at and taken care of. But as far as your board, there's a tip if you find that they've been stuck. In any job description, we have those sort of other related duties and principles, and these are true, again, universally, all boards. The one voice principle. So a board is a collective of individuals, but it's a single entity, so it speaks with one voice. All those individuals can talk around a board table, but once that decision is made, you need to speak with one voice. You need to support that decision, no matter how you felt as an individual and how you voted. If that principle goes away, things fall apart. So the one voice is important. Financial literacy, if you don't have it, get it. I think on the corporate side, there is a higher level of financial literacy, but on the nonprofit side, you may get people who have never seen a financial statement. So you need to bring them up to speed. Base your budget in facts and reasonable assumptions and expectations, not on wish lists. And nonprofits aren't the only ones with wish lists. I've seen corporations do it too. Corporations may have a requirement around an audit committee. We're seeing more audit committees in the nonprofit sector as well, but they're not they're not legislated. So be mindful of that. Financial stewardship is an imperative of every board, whether or not you've written it down or articulated it. So it's kind of like the fiduciary duty. It's ever present and needs to be looked at. Both kinds of companies require an annual general meeting at least once a year. You need to talk to your members or your shareholders, and then the legislation will tell you what items you must have there, and then you have an option to do other things around it. Which leads me to engagement and communication. A board is silly if it goes into an AGM without having first communicated with its members what's going to come to the meeting. If you're only talking to them once a year, you're missing an opportunity and you stand a very good chance of being derailed. And so there are lots of ways for board engagement and for communication. Transparency is a word I have some issues with. It means different things to different people, but it's okay to tell your members and shareholders what's keeping you up at night and what you as an organization are doing about it. Don't just hit them with it at the AGM. I was at an AGM last night and you know, we had to present a $7 million loss. But the fact is, everybody in the room already knew about it and knew what we'd been doing about it all year long. So they were just sort of getting the summary last night. If we hit them with that without any engagement and communication prior, we'd probably still be sitting there and we'd be worn out. And ultimately, because boards and organizations are people, it comes down to behavior, and I'm a big proponent of civility as well. So I do a lot of work with boards who've got themselves in trouble, and 9 times out of 10, it's behavior related. It's not about the policies, it's not about the constating documents, it's not even about engagement. I just have 2 more, and I see we're really coming close on our time. So board staff dynamics, again, it's about people. So the board is ultimately accountable in both corporations and nonprofits. But boards and staff are like water. They're going to find the cracks and they're going to move into it. So you need good policies on how the relationships are going to work. So if we parse it out as a reminder, governance is about that vision and purpose and goals and turning those into direction. Management makes decisions about how we're going to get there, what we need to do to get there. And then operations is the activities, the performance. On a nonprofit board, you get a lot more doers. They want to do the activities and perform the thing. And it's hard. You often have to pull them back to that governance mindset and don't let them stop in management where they start interfering with what the CEO and the management team are doing. But I find these 3 little pillars quite helpful when I'm facing a behavioral problem with an organization. I can see perhaps where they've landed and how we might help them correct. I'm just going to throw these up here as I do my closing remarks. So remember, the board is a collective of individuals. And then there's a list of things there that the board needs to do that are super important that I think we've covered here. True in corporations and nonprofits. And then as an individual, if you're a director, these are the things you personally do to help make the board model work and thereby make your organization or corporation successful. So 100% of us function better when we know what's expected of us. And so you see that they're not that different. They all rely on good people making good decisions on something that's greater than themselves. So with that, I will stop, and I think we have like 2 minutes left for questions.
Okay, thank you, Linda. We do have a couple questions in the chat. But just before those, I'm just gonna say thank you to everybody that attended. If you have to hop off because it is at the 1 hour mark, we will be posting a video that has the answers to the questions and everything like that. So thank you for attending. I do look forward to seeing you all at the next rescheduled CPD webinar on May 28th. It's going to be the Future of Truth, Human Intuition Meets AI in Detection Deception with Matthew Kane. This was the rescheduled one, so anybody who had already registered, you've already been re-registered into it. You don't need to re-register already. Please fill out the survey, everyone. We really appreciate all the results that come back from it. It helps inform the topics we're going to look at, as well as how you are feeling about the CPD sessions we offer. And the recording, as I said, will be available within 1 week. And for anybody that does want the presentation slides, you can email our info@cgiofcanada.ca and we can provide those upon request. So for anybody who has to hop off, go ahead. And Linda, if you're okay with it, we just have a couple questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so the first one here is, are there international financial reporting standards specifically to address the preparation of financial statements for not-for-profits?
I am not aware. It's hard enough to even get national standards or a provincial standard. So it doesn't mean somebody hasn't tried, but I do not have it. It's so legislation specific.
Next one here is, are not-for-profit boards for professional associations required to have a code of conduct for their general members?
In my experience, yes, they are. I do a lot of work with professional associations and regulated professions. Um, they would have a code of ethics, a standards of practice at a minimum. And I think there's one other document they need. Whether that code of ethics for members, I'm going to say I've never seen one that didn't have a code of ethics for members. What you then see is, does the board then adopt a code of ethics for itself and its operations? But certainly for members of the profession, I'm going to say yes. I haven't seen a regulated profession that didn't have one.
Perfect. The next question here is, would you comment on directors' responsibility for in-camera sessions?
Oh my gosh. I consider in-camera sessions a best practice for both nonprofit and corporations. But when I was a CEO, I found them terrifying. Like when the board would ask me to leave the room and then they're going to talk about me, I would just about climb the walls. So with best practice, what I like to do, um, well, no minutes in an in-camera session. These are my rules, my best practices. No minutes, no decisions made. It's just a time to talk, get your ducks in a row. Then you need to come back to the meeting proper to make your decision. I like to start board meetings with an in-camera with the CEO and the board before you kick off the meeting, but not the management team. Then you do the board meeting. Like, it's really just to get your ducks in a row meeting. Do the board meeting, and then at the end of the meeting, the board without the CEO and management. And it's mostly the board talking about its performance, unless it has some legal matters or CEO matters to discuss. And then, and this is important, a call between the board chair and the CEO just to debrief, not the details, but say, we were in camera for 25 minutes. We talked about this, and that. Um, and we'll pick up the rest in our regular meetings. But so I like to have an in camera as part of every board agenda so that it's not weird and scary. And I'm very particular that minutes are not kept, that anything substantive that comes out gets entered into the meeting proper. I hope that answers the question.
The next question here is, how does the concept of one voice affect/impact the concept of group think, where no one wants to upset the balance of the group, so everyone kind of agrees with everything?
Well, I see them as two different things, because the groupthink comes in the decision-making process. And a courageous board member will say, what they actually think, won't be part of groupthink, but they may not win the vote or the consensus, whatever decision-making model you use. So the one voice is after the decision is made. The groupthink, yeah, that's about board training. That's about being a good board chair. That's about other board members recognizing it and trying to help. Like, you can't just give full responsibility of everything to the chair. I think there's an opportunity from every seat at the table to make the board work better. And groupthink it's legit, but it's dangerous. And so if the chair doesn't see it, then you call it out from any seat. Try to get a different point of view, try to get the truth. But once the decision's made, get on board.
Perfect. And the last question here is, given the increasing complexities of not-for-profit governance and limited capacity, how do you recommend not-for-profits balance necessary governance skills versus lived experience or passion for the organization's purpose on the board?
I'm hearing all the beautiful words that I agree with, but I'm not exactly hearing the question. Could you maybe repeat that?
Yep. So, given the increasing complexities of not-for-profit governance and limited capacity, how do you recommend not-for-profits balance necessary governance skills with lived experience on the board?
Well, just because you're good at governance or some aspect of it doesn't mean you're not passionate. I think where we get into an issue with that is dealing with founders, which might be a whole other interesting topic to do. The founders, the original passion behind the whole thing, and then trying to take the organization in a different direction. I don't know how we balance it. We want to keep people passionate and not kill them with all the governance stuff. I get that not everybody's excited about it as I am. They're more excited about the cause and wanting to do the stuff. Again, the difference between the setting the vision and being the doer. And it's hard to keep people engaged up here. We often have to give them something to do to keep uh, that passion going. I'm not sure I can give a great answer to it. I hear it, but I don't know what the balance is.
Okay. So that looks like it's all the questions we have for today. So once again, thank you everyone for attending. That is going to be the end of our session.